Chapter 1. Who are disabled people? One consistent and stable characteristic throughout capitalism has been the inextricable link between disability and poverty. Disability is both cause and consequence of poverty. The social model of disability gives people with different impairments something to unite behind, just as different Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities are united by the experience of racial oppression. Focusing on shared barriers experienced across impairment groups gives people the potential to join together in greater numbers with greater shared power. The focus on material barriers is also able to draw in those who may not previously have identified as disabled. Looking both to the past and to the situation in Britain today, we can see that disabled identities are most clearly defined at moments of struggle for the material resources and conditions that people with impairments need in order to survive. Actions, although impairment specific from the past, convey a sense of what today would be termed disability pride. They also invariably occur concurrently with wider struggles over the division of wealth between the working class and the ruling class. During the Great Depression, the League of the Physically Handicapped fought job discrimination in the United States. Historians Paul K. Longmore and David Goldberger comment, the greatest influence on their political thinking and strategizing was the Depression-era climate of crisis and desperate activism. Since 2010, people who previously may not have identified as disabled have become involved in collective action against attempts by the UK government to cut and deny social security payments. Newer activists come from a far wider background of impairment than was present in earlier iterations of the disability movement. In these moments, disabled people find pride in our identities as we transcend the victim role of the oppressed to fight shared injustice. Chapter 3. From asylums to independent living, disabled people on the edge of society. Support for disabled people who've not worked and will never do so in a way perceived as productive does not flow from capitalism. It's something that can be fought for, granted in the interests of avoiding discontent among the wider populace. But as part of the social wage, it is of minimum priority. The term social wage is applied to spending that keeps the workforce employable and fit, such as education and healthcare. But as economist Chris Harman points out, it can also be applied to unemployment benefits for those able to show they are able and willing to work, and to pension schemes dependent on a lifetime of labour. Harman notes, the capitalist wants contented workers to exploit in the same way that a farmer wants contented cows. Workers cannot be expected to labour with any commitment to their work unless there is some sort of promise that they will not starve to death once they reach retirement age. Support for those unlikely to ever contribute to the labour market is of no direct interest to capitalists and is part of the social wage that governments will do their utmost to minimise accordingly. Analysis of the role that disability plays within capitalism leads to an understanding that full liberation from oppression for disabled people cannot be achieved under a system that puts profit before people. This is not to deny the importance in the here and now of challenging discrimination and campaigning for an equal standard of living for disabled people, regardless of impairment. We must fight for improvements, using as leverage the fact that capitalism prefers contented workers. More disabled people in Britain are living within the community now than in previous generations. As a result, the way we are treated has more of an impact on the wider working class. It can be difficult to raise awareness of what happens to disabled people because disability issues continue to be marginalised within wider society. Yet we are a substantial proportion of the population and we have friends, family and neighbours. The public cares sufficiently enough about what happens to disabled people for contemporary governments to be nervous of being seen to mistreat us. This can be used to resist changes that would harm disabled people and to fight for improvements. Ultimately, though, the intrinsic role that disability plays within a capitalist system means that, as expressed by Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes, only the transformation of capitalist society will ensure the full inclusion of disabled people and indeed all socially oppressed groups. Chapter 11, Forefront of the Fight Back. Forcing Atos, a global corporation with a revenue measured in billions, out of its contract to deliver the WCA was another significant victory for campaigners. As the WCA began to roll out, disability and benefit claimant networks soon became aware of its dangers. These were communicated through the wider anti-austerity movement, and individual stories of wrongful benefit decisions and the human misery they were causing started to appear in the left-wing media. Protests against Atos, organised by groups such as DPAC and Boycott Workfare, failed to permeate into the mainstream. With the benefit fraud narrative dominating the media and political rhetoric, it was an issue that was not readily accepted as part of the public agenda. That was until Atos's sponsorship of the London 2012 Paralympic Games handed campaigners a golden opportunity. We knew we'd done our job when Cameron and Osborne were greeted by booing crowds as they attempted to hand out medals to the disabled athletes. To coincide with the Paralympics, DPAC and UK Uncut planned a week of action entitled the Anti-Atos Games. This was supported by a wide range of anti-austerity campaigns, DDPOs, deaf and disabled people's organisations, and trade unions. The activities commenced with our own opening ceremony, which was a parody of the assessment process. Over the week, there was a day of protests outside local Atos assessment centres up and down the country, a memorial protest to commemorate those who died and suffered at the hands of the WCA, which appeared on Newsnight, and social media activities targeting Atos and the Department for Work and Pensions. 2 separate investigative documentaries on the work capability assessment aired that same week. The final event was a mass protest outside Atos headquarters on the 31st of August 2012. It was attended by around 450 to 500 people. At the same time, in a parallel action, disabled activists and allies acting as buddies for those needing personal assistance occupied the lobby of the DWP's headquarters, Caxton House. The Atos protest journeyed across London to join them, and a celebratory atmosphere took hold, inspired by this simple act of defiance. The mood turned to one of determination when inappropriate tactics on the part of the Met Police in separating the 2 groups at the entrance of the government department resulted in one wheelchair user having his shoulder dislocated and an occupier becoming DPAC's first member to be arrested. The remaining occupiers held out, and footage of them emerging to the cheering crowd waiting outside made the primetime news that evening. By the end of that week, Atos had become a household name. And just for the final passage that I was going to read, from the final chapter, chapter 12, concluding thoughts, where do we go from here? The ongoing war against disabled people. In December 2019, the most right-wing government in modern British history was re-elected with a significantly increased majority. This was disastrous news for disabled people. Under Boris Johnson, the Conservatives now had the parliamentary power not simply to carry on in the same direction with the continuation of policies that are growing inequality, poverty and immiseration, but to ramp up their attacks and implement welfare reform measures they were previously beaten back from achieving. An early indication of what the election result meant for disabled people was the decision announced in the New Year's Honours List to award Ian Duncan Smith a knighthood. Duncan Smith had not held a ministerial appointment since his period as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. The honour effectively endorses the dismantling of the social security safety net over which he presided. It also suggests full government commitment to rolling out Duncan Smith's big idea, universal credit, in spite of the well-evidenced harms it's caused and is causing. Disabled people should be under no illusion about who Boris Johnson is, however anti-establishment and affable he tries to portray himself. Both Johnson and his close advisor Dominic Cummings have expressed views that have been described as textbook examples of eugenic opinion. Speaking to city bankers during his time as Mayor of London, Johnson said, Whatever you think of the value of IQ tests, it is surely relevant to a conversation about equality that as many as 16% of our species have an IQ below 85, while about 2% have an IQ above 130. The harder you shape the pack, the easier it will be for some cornflakes to get to the top. And for one reason or another, boardroom greed, or as I am assured, the natural and God-given talent of boardroom inhabitants, the income gap between the top cornflakes and the bottom cornflakes is getting wider than ever. Inequality is a state that Johnson and Cummings both regard as natural and even desirable for the functioning of society. Progressive disability policy making will not be on their agenda. What we must be prepared for are regressive measures deliberately aimed at resegregating and isolating disabled people in the better interests of society, according to a eugenicist view, in reality, in the interests of profit making. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go straight into the questions then. So why did you write the book, Ellen, and what do you hope it achieves? But also, how did you find and cope with the process of writing it, which I think would be quite hard for so many different reasons? And which bits did you find easiest and which bits were the hardest to write?
So I suppose I wrote it because a commissioning editor from Zed Books called Ken Barlow contacted me and said, we realise we have a bit of a gap in terms of disability in you know our catalogue, and I've heard I should speak to you, and would you write a book on disability and what's been happening since 2010? And I jumped at the opportunity because I love reading, I love researching, I love writing. I think what I'd kind of forgotten though was that I don't like being singled out. I really enjoy being part of a collective. I think that humans are best when we're part of a interdependent collective. And I forgot that it would have to be my book rather than DPAC's book. And I think that was probably the hardest bit for me, that my name is on there rather than all the names of all the amazing campaigners like yourself and everyone involved tonight, and so many others who have made the amazing grassroots struggle from disabled people happen since 2010. I guess what I wanted to achieve, I suppose, initially, because I wasn't confident anyone would actually read it, but I think what I wanted to do was to put down on the historical record what actually happened, especially from an activist perspective. I think disabled people are very used to other people talking about us and writing our history for us. I know Mike Oliver, the late great Mike Oliver, before he died, he warned us that we needed to write our own history because it was already getting written for us. I've quite often been to meetings where people involved in kind of non-disabled academics have talked about the UN investigation, for example, the unprecedented investigation that took place in 2015, that the members of DPAC, such as Debbie Jolly, Linda Burnett, Bob Ellard, Anita Bellows, you know, they triggered it, but they talk about it as if it kind of just happened, or the UN decided to make it happen, without even knowing or acknowledging the role that grassroots activism played in that happening. And I wanted to make sure that people know how change actually happens. It's quite convenient for the ruling class to present history as something, you know, any kind of changes that are handed down to us from above. That's not how things happen. As John said, we only get progressive change when we unite and we demand that change. So I wanted to make sure that that account of how things actually happen, how change actually happens, was written down.
Thank you. So, and what were the bits that you found the hardest and easiest?
I think I enjoyed being able to write down our analysis because I think people often portray DPAC as vulgar or thuggish. Those are words that have been used to describe us. But actually we have quite a thought through analysis behind what we do, a political analysis, and I wanted, I suppose, to put that down. So that's probably the easiest thing. It was very cathartic for me. The hardest thing was definitely doing it as me without, I mean, I had so much support from all of you, but the fact it was, yeah, I don't believe in individualism. I don't like being an individual. That bit's been horrible.
Okay, so let's go on to the other questions. The next one is from Jamie, who describes himself as an activist and campaigner, and always one to lead the chanting, which made me smile. So his question is in two parts. Part one is, what was your favorite, most impactful, in the words of our late friend and campaigner Stephen Asselford, DPAC naughtiness? In inverted commas. So that's part one of the question. And the second part is, with such superb and powerful voices for disabled people lost or sidelined from Parliament, how can we build on their good work?
I think it's lovely that Jamie's referenced Stephen. He was another person that we really miss. We only lost him at the end of last year. He described the direct actions that DPAC does as DPAC naughtiness, and he used to do it with such a big smile. Stephen was a person labelled with learning difficulties who'd experienced a lot of oppression in his own life. He was, he was so insightful, but often people would kind of ignore what he was saying when he actually had really good points to make, because he was disabled, because he had a learning difficulty, because he communicated in ways they couldn't always understand. And I think for him, when we would do a direct action that I would call cheeky, some people call thuggish, it made him feel, it gave him a sense of power to take part in it that he'd never felt before in his life. And I think that's there's a bit in the book, in the resistance chapter, where I talk about why we do these things. And I think it's important. I mean, it can be impactful because society has a view of disabled people as, passive victims. And when we challenge that and we do things where we're taking the offensive, it can make people notice. But also really important, it gives people hope. So when we did the Balls to the Budget protest, when Osborne was announcing a budget in Parliament at the same time that was going to, cut loads of the off disability benefits, it was going to be horrendous for disabled people, and with allies we hung that massive banner opposite Parliament saying balls to the budget with two fingers literally on it. And it gave people who were about to be affected, were going to have their vital income affected, to see that on social media, it just brought them a smile. And people just need that hope to be able to carry on, but also to feel that we do have agency, that disabled people, despite what we face, have agency and can fight back. So that's why I love the idea of DPAC naughtiness. My favourite one, it's very difficult to answer because we've done so many, probably when I think the media called it the storming of Parliament, where ILF users were gathered in the lobby of the House of Commons and tried to get into the chamber while Cameron was doing Prime Minister's questions. As I've said in the book, I think if a direct action like that had happened earlier, we may well have saved the ILF. We may well have done, but people weren't confident to do it. I think obviously people have a hope that there is someone in power that's going to look down and pity you and come in and rescue you. But the truth is, as John McDonnell has always told us all the way through, you build a movement and you build a grassroots movement, you put pressure from outside, and that's how you achieve change. So in relation, I think, to part two of Jamie's question, we have lost valuable allies within Parliament, but how we affect real change, as John always told us, is from outside, and that's what we have to carry on doing.
Excellent. Thank you. Hang on. Get my questions back up here. So So I've got one final question, and that's from Mike Smith, who runs the Disabled People's Organisation REAL, and it's based in Tower Hamlets, London. His question is, disability is largely a label or construct placed on an individual by others rather than by self-definition, and in contrast to most other equality strands. Consequently, very few disabled people claim to be proud to be disabled. What do we have to do to create the level of anger required amongst disabled people to trigger a collective response as impressive as the Black Lives Matter campaign?
There's loads I want to say in response to that. How long have we got?
I have no idea. Who's in charge of time? Stephanie.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. So I think that another point that's made in the book is that many disabled people don't identify as disabled, but I think that increasingly under the material circumstances since 2010, more people have been, because we've got that definition under, well, with the DDA, now the Equality Act, and what a label of being disabled can access you can be the kind of material support you need to survive. So more and more people are being pushed out of society. The inequality gap is growing. If you fit the definition of disabled, you can then apply for things like disability benefits that may help you and support you to get by. So I think actually what we've seen are greater numbers of people identifying as disabled. They might not understand the social model of disability, but I think that this gives us an opportunity, and as I said in one of the extracts I read before the break, I think that we're strongest, disabled people are strongest in our struggle at moments when our material conditions are being contravened, and that offers us an opportunity to unite beyond the people who might previously have just identified as disabled. And I think we have to use those opportunities to bring people together to unite our resistance. I think though that we also need to be allying with other groups who are oppressed. So I think it's amazing. I know lots of disabled campaigners have been very involved in Black Lives Matter and what's been happening there. I think that we need to, I think one of the strengths of DPAC has been that we haven't seen ourselves in isolation. We haven't mistrusted non-disabled people. We've proactively gone out to seek alliances with other groups of working class people who are experiencing oppression and try to unite, because we know that we need the bigger numbers. I think the disabled people on our own, given all the barriers we face to getting out, I mean, the reason why we use direct action is because so few of us can get out for a protest. We're not going to mass thousands and thousands because of all those barriers. We need to be involved in the wider struggle. So in conclusion, I think that's what we need to do.